Hey guys, this is DFD, aka Dark Pros and Deaths, back with another Kamihime project video. This one is a guide on the light malicious raid, and it is also considered one of the harder raids in the game, especially if you're doing it for the first time because of its mechanics actually are kind of punishing for earlier players. But generally, what this guide is going to go over is basically the mechanics of the fight, how to basically do it. It's a little straightforward once you understand it. It's just getting to that point might take a little bit for at least the free-to-play Dark players. When it comes to the ones to spend, they might actually get a little bit luckier. But generally, this fight, you do want to do it because it's going to lead into some pretty powerful weapons for light characters. It's also going to give you some materials that you may need later down the line, so keep that in mind. But also, it has been nerfed since the guide I'm looking at. So that said, I will go over the changes that happened with the raid, so remember that. But generally, defense value is 10, which is standard for this game. If any enemy has less defense, you basically deal more damage. And if any enemy has more defense, you basically deal less damage. So that's something to remember. It's got 2 charge turns before it uses its burst. There's also 450 million HP, not 850 million. Because all the malicious raids, except for Och, have been nerfed. So the elemental malicious raids, as I like to call them, they're 450 million HP now. Which basically cuts the raid in half. So that's a big thing. Now, things are standard between all the malicious raids and even a few other things in the game. It is resistant to anything that is not elemental advantage, meaning that if you use light against it, you deal less damage. If you use wind against it, you deal less damage. You have to use dark against the light enemies if you want to deal maximum damage. So that said, try to use elemental advantage if you can, especially with some of the raid mechanics. But also, if you are not using elemental advantage, then it reduces the chances of you landing debuffs, unless the character has guaranteed chance of landing it. So that said, don't expect your debuffs to land. Only if you have dark will you have a very good chance of landing debuffs. Also, something that these raids tend to have, a resistance towards effects that will prevent it from having turns. That means you can land stuff like dizzy, paralysis, flame bind, all of those different effects, but they won't actually work. So what this does is allow some characters that may need to land those effects to get a special effect. It will still allow it to land, but it won't let it interrupt the turn, so that's something to know. You also can't increase its max orb count, so don't even try to increase it from 2 to 3. You can, however, remove the current orbs it has, or prevent it from gaining current orbs, so that's still allowed. And also, something unique to all the malicious raids, they cut your damage cut in half. Meaning that if you have actual damage cut or elemental resistance, it's no longer a 30% or a 40%, it is half that effect. So if you have 20% in damage cut and 10% in light resistance, you only have 15% in damage cut, not 30. So be careful of that. That now means you need 200% worth in order to fully block something. But also, you need to keep this one thing in mind, that elemental still lowers or increases the chances of you landing debuffs. So elemental resistance, elemental attack, that still has normal effect when it comes to your debuff rates. It's only the damage cut that's reduced. Now, another thing that's also unique to all malicious raids, they switch between different gear modes every 5 turns. Normal is what it starts at, then it goes to blue, then it goes to red, then it goes back to normal. Every 5 turns it will switch gears. So that means it takes a 15 turn cycle in order to go through all of them, and then it'll repeat. And unless you really know what you're doing, do not burst in normal gear. Because all the malicious raids have a counter when you burst with any character in normal gear. So that means you have to avoid basically bursting for 1/3 of the fight. unless you really know what you're doing. Blue gear always has conditions where you have to deal enough damage, and then on top of that, you also have to meet a second condition, and it will make red gear easier for you. Otherwise, it will make it harder. And don't worry if you can't meet this condition, but at the same time, if you know you could, then try to do so. Red gear is basically where the boss is like in a quote-unquote aggressive state, where it's going to start dealing a little bit more stuff, and the transition from blue to red is also pretty damaging for each Malicious raid too, so be careful with that one. But after red gear, it switches back to normal and the cycle repeats. Now, unique to this fight specifically are two things. One, throughout the entire fight, it's going to consistently stack fixed damage buffs on itself. That means that at the end of the turn, you will get slapped with a specific amount of damage based on how many stacks. Now, I don't fully remember the upper limit of the stacks. I think it was like 12 or something. But this is the main reason why you do want to have some pretty decent teams for this fight, because you have to deal 25 million damage to remove the stacks. You don't have to deal it in one turn. It carries over across turns. But the second you deal 25 million, it will reset its stacks at the end of the turn. So keep that in mind. But also, it's not the only damage requirement as well. Every blue gear for every Malicious raid wants you to deal 50 million damage within 5 turns. So that's something to know. But the secondary condition is unique to this raid, where it wants 2 full bursts within a blue gear. That means you're going to spend 2 turns doing a full burst. And it has to be a full burst. So make sure you can fill up your burst gauges pretty quickly if you're trying to go after the blue gear condition. Now, in the case of red gear conditions, if you meet the requirements, then it will increase the damage it takes. If you don't meet the requirements, it will increase the damage it resists. So that's something to know. Now, it says that it takes 25% more damage if you meet it, and it takes 20% less damage if you don't meet the blue gear condition. So be careful with that one. And also, something that's unique to this raid as well, which we'll go over a little bit more in detail later, it does land more stacks of that fixed damage buff whenever it's in red gear, so be careful with that. But something that's also across every single Malicious raid, at half HP, it gets a little bit stronger through a attack and defense buff that you cannot remove. It is 25% to both, and because you can't remove it, that means you have to have another 25% in defense or attack down to offset it. There is a lower limit of 50%, so that means you can cut defense in half, cut attack in half, but in order to hit the lower limit after this point, you have to have another 25%, so that's 75% total you need if you want to stay at the lower limit. Now, when it goes into different modes, this is where it gets a little bit tricky depending on what you do, because if you burst period point blank, it will give 4 of its fixed damage buffs to itself at the end of the turn, while also dealing damage to everybody. The thing is, if you happen to reset the buff stacks, it will add 4 after all the other ones get removed. So if you can actually handle it, you can probably get away with bursting on this one. But I wouldn't try it unless you can consistently deal 25 million damage in a full burst. So that's something to know. And then on top of that too, don't forget that the 4 stacks of the guaranteed damage is going to deal at the end of the turn also means it's 4,000 HP until the stacks get removed. And it's just going to add more stacks onto it later. So make sure that if you ever want to burst in normal mode, you have to make sure that you have 25 million damage in your full burst. Make sure you're dishing out a lot of damage. And the thing is too, it even has priority over its full orb moves too, so you can get it to waste its orbs if you really want to. Now, in normal gear, if you use a red ability, it will deal basically double the damage to one character that it would normally do to everybody, but it still gives one buff to itself. If you don't use a red ability, it will instead be AoE. Well, it says single enemy here, but I remember it being AoE for the damage it deals. But either way, make sure that you're paying attention to when you use red abilities, because when you use red abilities, it can kind of redirect things to one character if you want, depending on if they have a cover ability or not. But otherwise, you don't have to worry about it too much, because you're just still getting the same amount of stacks on the boss anyway. It's just that you have to worry about if you burst or not, because if you decide to burst during normal gear, make sure you're able to at least reset the stacks. And then make sure you can handle it after the fact. Now then, blue gear, it's going to do 2 random hits and then grant a stack to itself, so there's that. However, the most dangerous part of this fight is easily the transition from blue to red gear, because it's going to hit you pretty hard. And it is the single most damaging hit in the game, like of its entire arsenal, not in the game. So that said, I repeat, do not take this attack head on unless you have a lot of HP, because this generally does, like, to my knowledge, about 20 to 30,000, somewhere around that mark, if you have literally no protection, like no attack downs, no defense ups, stuff like that. Now, when it comes to red gear, like I said, it's going to start dishing out some AoE hits, but the bigger thing is the fact that it's going to grant 2 stacks of that special buff it has instead of 1. So it's going to start ramping up a little bit faster. Be very, very careful of that. And also, if at any point it has full orbs, it's going to give 2 stacks of its buff to itself while also hitting 1 character. However, if it's below half HP, it becomes 3 stacks. So that will really ramp things up. You may want somebody that can remove orbs. So there's that to know about. And as for the summary of the damage you receive right here that it has, this is generally if you don't have any protection, period, point blank. Like I said, the blue to red gear transition is the most damaging part of it. But when it has when it does its burst counter, it's like 6,000 to everybody. But the thing is, remember the follow-up stack, so it's basically doing like 10,000 off of that. And if it does its burst, it's basically doing like 9,000 instead per hit. And then the red ability is like supposedly 12,000 per hit. But keep in mind, if you have maxed out attack down, these numbers are already cut in half. And then on top of that too, it also depends on your defense up as well. And you can still use damage cut and all that too to resist these things. So keep that in mind. Now, generally they have these recommended souls, but this I have to go a little bit differently, because when it comes to this fight, you definitely do want to try to survive as long as possible. So Asclepius and Romulus definitely are good for survival, but I would suggest going more towards the damage aspect of this because of the fact that you have to reset those stacks as quickly as possible. So that said, I would pick souls that were best suited to increasing your damage. Like, I know there's a lot of people that pick Charlemagne as their first soul for some reason, even though my suggestion you probably shouldn't. But if you do go with her, she's got a special ability where it takes 100 MP, but it gives you something called critical, and it's guaranteed for like 3 or 4 turns. I forgot how many exactly, but that could actually be very helpful for this, because you can get another damage multiplier that will help you out. So if you want to do some quick short-term damage, that's an option. The better short-term damage options that I would suggest is Paracelsus, like they have here, or Yorimitsu, because they both have a very powerful damage plus ability for their 100 MP skills. And Paracelsus is even better for that one than Yori, but you may or may not need Yori for the if you're going after the blue gear condition, so keep that in mind. but either one will definitely give you a nice little damage increase. Then on top of that too, Caspar could be a good one too because you can stay up on offense while giving some other effects as well, or maybe you can get a little bit of healing while still trying to remain offensive to an extent. You also may want to consider Perseus for this fight because Perseus now has a wound debuff, which will also help increase the damage you deal. So that's also another option. Then if we go into the higher tier souls, which would be the S2 souls, essentially, Edison's always a good pick if you can dish out a lot of damage with her. There's also Benkei, who, in my personal opinion, this fight works better with Rebellion compared to Vigor. So if you do want to go a Rebellion setup, Benkei is definitely the girl to go for. However, do not keep Benkei at very low HP, or the guaranteed damage will bypass her special effect. So you have to be very wary of that. Kong Ming's a very safe bet for this as well, because Kong Ming is basically going to strengthen your team and weaken the enemy throughout the fight. So that's just guaranteed help. Then on top of that too, Alexander's also not a bad option as well for this, because Alexander's pretty offensive, and then on top of that, if you happen to lose some characters, which you probably will, then Alexander gets stronger. And if you really want to, you can have 2 dark characters that can quickly get rid of themselves just to put Alexander to max strength. However, you may want to keep one of those characters depending on what state you have her in. And that's something I'll get to in a second. But last but not least too, this is an S1 soul, but Hector is also a very, very good option if you want to try and dish out some very good damage quickly, because Hector has a very, very powerful 100 MP skill. You need a lot of damage multipliers for it, but it will help you out a lot with getting through these stacks or just nuking the crap out of the boss. So keep that in mind. And then we're going to have more later on, because at the time of this video it's still before 8th anniversary, so we don't have access to the 3rd S rank souls, but they are extremely powerful. Most of them have something that gives special attack, so a lot of them are very good bets if you want to try and dish out more damage on this fight. But if you have an S3 soul, then that means you probably grinded this fight quite a bit anyway, so that's something to know. Now, as for characters, there is quite a lot that I want to suggest, and I don't know if they have all of them here, but they're suggesting Osiris, who actually isn't bad because when she heals, she gets burst gauge as well, so that helps you out with clearing the blue gear condition. Pluto is also very good and has a good mix of offense and defense from her buffs. Nefertum is also very good because she can debuff, she can heal, she can give you a little bit of damage protection. Set also might be good, but keep the one thing in mind that she's more or less just there for the heal and the attack debuff. So there's that. Excuse me. But they don't have her listed here because I think it was before then. But there was Awakened Kali, who is very, very powerful when used correctly. Now, be careful with the fixed damage thing, because that can probably bypass Kali's little damage ignore thing that she tends to have for like 4 hits. But used correctly, Kali will be one of your better damage dealers. Then on top of that, Awakened Chernobog and Awakened Thanatos. Those are also pretty good, especially if you pair them with Paracelsus, because they're based on normal attacks. So that's how you can get a pretty solid normal attack team to really rack up some of the damage. And then, you don't hear too much about her, but Hades is also a bit of a defensive one. But it's really up to you if you want that little bit of extra defense from her, because, my personal opinion, she's not really worth the eyes to awaken her, but she is still an option, so consider her if you don't have much better. Same case for Satan, because Satan's not too good, but again, she's also normal attack, so if you don't happen to have anything better, but she might go with your Paracelsus team if you make one. Then on top of that, there's also Amon Unleashed. Her Unleashed version, kind of decent. Got a pretty strong debuff for defense because it's like 30% or so. But the bigger thing with her is the fact that if you happen to have gone through her Heavenly Awakening, that's when she really skyrockets. Now, at the time of this video, she doesn't have one, but she will get one pretty soon. So that's something to know. But it is very, very strong. So that's another one to consider. And these are all permanent characters. Now, some of the limited ones. They have Dark Ash. I would also add on to this list Dark Frey. Like, well, the first Dark Frey, because Japanese said I'd get another one. But those two, very good burst-oriented characters. They will greatly help you out a lot. Nyarlathotep is very, very good for this because she is debuff incarnate. And then she also has wound as well. If you pair her with Perseus, I do believe that's full uptime on wound. So that's something to note. She's also got a random chance of putting debuff called Pressure on the boss as well. So Nyarlathotep can actually help with that one, because Pressure will prevent orb gain as long as it's active. So that's not something that the boss defends against. And even more so, if she does land Restraint, it's not going to interrupt the boss's turn, but it counts as extra defense down. So something to remember. They have a SSR version of Diablos here. Very, very good for this fight. She has a super buff where everybody needs to stay at full, well, not full, but needs to have 100 burst gauge. Some characters can actually go past 100, but if you happen to get that, then you can probably time it in order to get a very, very massive buff where she's going to just help you out across the board with that. She can also remove orbs. Literally all the orbs the current boss has in one shot, so that's something to know. Also does some decent follow-up damage as well if you really want to. Other limited characters that they don't have on this list because of, the timing of when this was made. The dark version of Soul is very, very good because she has a bit of healing, but mainly Soul's big thing is a special buff she has called SP Vigor, as it's called. And Vigor normally goes by your current HP. SP Vigor goes by your max alone. So, when paired with Rebellion, that is very powerful. It is a valid way to get Vigor and Rebellion on the same team if you have Dark Soul. However, that is the only time you should consider having any sort of Vigor on a team with Rebellion, because, again, SP Vigor goes by your max HP. You need quite a lot of it, honestly, like 62 or 63,000 to get full effect, but either way, it's still good. But, there's also, I think she's permanent as well, but there's also Dark Aether, who's very good for Rebellion teams and just survival in general, because she gives you pretty tanky buffs, but it will cost your HP. And I know there's also Dark Vaughn as well, who's also pretty solid for this fight as well. I remember Dark Vaughn is like a vigor version of Aether, to my knowledge. That's a better way to describe that one. Then on top of that, there's another limited character called Dark Bow. Very solid damage increases across the board. She plays a very good role for a lot of different teams. Someone to consider. Then on top of that too, if you are going the Alexander route, consider having Prosperfina. I think I pronounced her name. Because if you want, you can quickly get rid of her turn 1, and that will automatically make Alexander stronger. So that's something to know. And then pair it with Kali as well. If you don't have Kali awakened, consider Prosperfina and Kali together just to make Alexander go the required two lost characters in order to get the most optimal power out of her. So there's that. So there's a bit of a sacrifice strat here. But another limited character that is also very good, and she's coming soon, because at the time of this video is like right before 8th anniversary. Satanachia, very, very strong dark character for this as well, because she can help you out with ability damage teams, get some very good damage in there and whatnot. And then there's also one more, which would be I forgot both of their names. I think it's Marie and Sophia, but it's like 2 characters in one. They're also pretty solid for this fight as well, for some coverage and some damage dealing. If you want to be honest, Dark has a lot of different options character-wise for this fight. The issue is actually their weapons when it comes to free players anyway. Because their weapons, if you have not been grinding them, you will not see Vigor or Rebellion weapons until the Zodiac weapons. And this is one of the fights that can give the coins for the Zodiac. So remember that. Then on top of that, if you did not pick a Gari Rept, you probably don't have a large stinger weapon. That is one of the easiest ways for Dark to get a large stinger. And large stinger will help you out greatly in this fight. You can get a smaller version from Artron, but it's more random compared to the large version. And then on top of that too, this is still before the time that Dark gets their versatility weapon, but consider grabbing that whenever you can. That will greatly help you out across the board, no matter what element it is. Versatility weapons are very strong. Even having just one of them with no limit breaks makes a difference. So that said, it's more what weapons you have for Dark compared to the characters, because their characters are pretty flexible across the board. It's more the damage you can dish out, because again, you have 2 damage conditions throughout this fight, and one of them is literally throughout the entire fight. The other one is like 1/3 of it. So remember, blue gear condition, whether or not you care about it, that's a thing, but you still have to deal 25 million damage as soon as possible to keep the stacks low. So the more frequently you can dish out 25 million damage, the better you will do in this fight. So remember that. And one last thing I could suggest too with this fight as well is to absolutely stay on top of your current HP, because you really have to pay attention to it because of those the guaranteed damage from those buff stacks that the boss gets. So worst case, you can see 5 digits getting ticked off in a turn. Just be very careful of that. But anyways, that's all for this. And I do believe this is the 4th video I've done for Malicious raids. There will be 2 more, and then I will finally start getting into the next tier up, which is Malicious Plus. But again, this fight, if you want to be honest, is pretty straightforward. It's more or less like a damage race. It's just a matter of getting that damage. So again, debuffing greatly helps for that, especially if you have Naruto-Tep, because Naruto-Tep is very, very good for this because she gives a lot of debuffing and gives a wound thing. And then on top of that, maybe Perseus if you want to go that route too. Just make sure your characters can dish out more damage as well. There's a lot of different options you want to go. It's just trying to get that damage. I cannot stress that enough. But anyways, that's all for this. More will come soon, and take care.